Captain Jake Martinez stared out the window of the military transport ship as it cut through the atmosphere of planet Silvara, and his hands trembled slightly against the cold metal frame because 3 years had passed since he last saw this world. Yet every detail remained burned into his memory like a brand on his soul. And now he was finally coming back to the place where he had left his heart behind. The purple clouds parted to reveal crystalline forests that sparkled in the light of twin suns, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat, just like it had the first time he saw this impossible beauty, back when he was bleeding and dying, and certain his life would end on this alien world far from home and far from everyone he loved. But fate had intervened in the form of an elf princess with silver hair and golden eyes who changed everything he thought he knew about the universe. Commander Lisa Parker sat across from him reviewing diplomatic protocols on her tablet, and she glanced up occasionally to study Jake with an expression that mixed curiosity and concern, because she had read his original mission reports a dozen times, and nowhere in those carefully worded documents had he mentioned forming any personal connections with the native population. Yet something in his behavior over the past 3 years suggested he had left something important unsaid. The other members of the diplomatic team chatted nervously among themselves, discussing what they knew about Silveran culture and speculating about what the elf people would be like. And Jake listened to their theories with half an ear, knowing that everything they imagined would fall short of the reality, because no amount of academic study could prepare someone for the sheer otherworldly presence of beings who lived for centuries and commanded dragons with their thoughts alone. 3 years ago, Jake had been part of an exploration mission that went catastrophically wrong when their small shuttle encountered an unexpected meteor storm and crashed into the jungle canopy of Silvara, killing everyone aboard except him. And he had dragged himself from the burning wreckage with a broken leg and cracked ribs, leaving a trail of blood through the bioluminescent undergrowth while alien predators tracked his scent through the darkness. He remembered the terror of that night, hearing things moving through the trees around him, and knowing he had no way to defend himself because his weapon had been lost in the crash and his communicator was smashed beyond repair, and he was utterly alone on a planet that no human had ever explored before, with creatures that saw him as nothing more than prey, waiting to be devoured. But then everything changed when the predators suddenly scattered in blind panic, fleeing from something that terrified them, far more than they terrified him. And Jake looked up through pain-clouded vision to see her standing in a shaft of moonlight like something from an ancient legend, and Princess Kira was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever witnessed in his entire life. She stood nearly 6 feet tall with a presence that commanded respect without saying a word, and her silver hair fell past her waist, catching the light like liquid mercury. And her eyes glowed with an inner fire that was decidedly not human, and she wore armor made from materials he could not identify that seemed to shift colors as she moved. And behind her stood 2 massive dragons who watched him with intelligence that was frighteningly aware. Jake had tried to speak, but only blood came from his mouth, and Kira moved toward him with fluid grace, while her dragons flanked her protectively, and she knelt beside him studying his injuries, with those golden eyes that seemed to see right through his skin to his bones beneath. And she spoke in a language that sounded like music mixed with wind chimes, but he understood nothing except the tone, which was neither hostile nor particularly warm, just curious and calculating. She made a decision then that saved his life, placing her hand on his chest and speaking words that made the air around them shimmer, and Jake felt warmth spread through his body, dulling the pain to manageable levels. And then she lifted him as easily as if he weighed nothing, and placed him on the back of her larger dragon, and the creature's scales felt warm beneath him like sun-heated stone, and they took flight into the night sky. The journey to her sanctuary remained fragmented in his memory because he drifted in and out of consciousness, but he remembered the sensation of flying, and the sight of floating islands connected by bridges of living crystal, and waterfalls that flowed upward, defying gravity, and forests that glowed with their own internal light, painting the world in shades of blue and purple and green, that Earth had no names for. Kira's home was hidden deep within a cave system, formed entirely from massive crystals that channeled sunlight throughout the interior, creating a space that felt both vast and intimate at the same time. And she had laid him on a bed of something soft that conformed to his body, and began treating his injuries with a combination of technology and what he later learned was magic, though she insisted there was no real difference between the two. Over the following weeks, as Jake healed, they found ways to communicate through gestures and drawings, and the universal language of facial expressions, and slowly Jake learned words in her language while teaching her words in his. And Kira proved to be an incredibly fast learner, picking up concepts that should have taken months in mere days, and her intelligence was matched only by her patience as she repeated lessons until he understood. The dragon's thunder and whisper became constant companions during his recovery, and Jake learned that they were not pets, but partners bonded to Kira through a connection that went deeper than mere training, and they could share thoughts and emotions across distances. And the dragons themselves were ancient beings who had lived for thousands of years and would live for thousands more. Thunder was the larger of the two, with scales like polished obsidian that reflected light in rainbow patterns, and his eyes held wisdom that made Jake feel like a child in comparison. And the dragon seemed amused by the fragile human who had stumbled into their world, but also curious about what made this strange being worth saving. Whisper was smaller and more playful, with scales that shifted through every color imaginable depending on her mood. And she took particular interest in Jake, often resting her massive head near him, so he could touch her scales and feel the warmth that radiated from her body. And both dragons accepted him in a way that Kira later told him was extremely rare, because dragons were notoriously selective about who they allowed near them. As Jake's body healed his initial fear, transformed into fascination and then into something deeper, as he spent every day with Kira learning about her world and sharing stories about his own. And she told him about Silveran history spanning back tens of thousands of years, and about her role as princess and protector of the crystal forests, and about the isolation her people had chosen, maintaining distance from the rest of the galaxy to preserve their way of life. Jake told her about Earth and humanity's relatively brief history, and about the wars and struggles that had defined his species, and about his family back home and his career as an explorer, and about the driving curiosity that made humans venture into the unknown despite the dangers. And Kira listened with an intensity that made him feel like every word mattered, like his stories were precious gifts she wanted to preserve forever. He could not pinpoint the exact moment when gratitude became friendship, and friendship became something more. But somewhere, between learning her language and teaching her about human music, between riding on dragon back through crystal canyons and sharing meals under alien stars, Jake realized he had fallen completely and hopelessly in love with an elf princess from another world. And the tragedy was that he could see in her eyes that she felt the same way. Now, 3 years later, Jake was returning to Silvara as part of an official diplomatic mission, and his heart pounded with hope and fear in equal measure, because he had no idea if Kira still thought about him, or if she had moved on with her long life, finding someone more suitable than a human whose lifespan would barely register as a moment in her centuries of existence. The transport ship touched down in the same clearing where Jake had been rescued 3 years ago, and he recognized every detail of the landscape, from the arrangement of the crystal trees to the way sunlight refracted through their transparent branches, creating patterns of light that danced across the mossy ground. And for a moment he was transported back to that final day when the Earth rescue ship had arrived to take him home, and he had been forced to choose between duty and love. Lisa stood and gestured for the team to prepare for departure, and the diplomats gathered their equipment, while security personnel checked their weapons, even though they had been briefed repeatedly that any show of aggression toward the Silveran people would be considered an act of war. And Jake moved through the motions automatically, his mind entirely focused on the possibility that he might see Kira again within minutes or hours or days. The landing ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss, and Jake was the first to step onto Silveran soil, breathing in the sweet, spicy air that he had dreamed about for 3 years, and every scent triggered memories of time spent in crystal caves and flying through purple skies and falling asleep to the sound of dragon breathing in the darkness, and he had to steady himself against the overwhelming rush of emotion. Lisa came to stand beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder and asked quietly if he was all right, and Jake nodded without taking his eyes off the forest, because he knew what was coming. Even before the other team members noticed that every sound had ceased and the natural buzz of alien insects had gone silent, and the birds that had been calling from the treetops had stopped mid-song, the security chief named Derek Brown raised his hand in a signal that made everyone freeze, and he scanned the tree line with professional wariness, while the other soldiers formed a defensive perimeter around the diplomats and Jake wanted to tell them that their weapons would be useless if the Silverans meant them harm, but he held his tongue because he understood their need to feel like they had some control over the situation. Then the sky darkened as two massive shapes descended through the canopy, and Thunder landed first with enough force to shake the ground and create small cracks in the soil, and his obsidian scales gleamed like wet stone, and his eyes fixed on Jake with clear recognition, and behind him, Whisper touched down more gently, and her scales rippled through shades of blue and green and silver, and she made a sound that was almost like a purr. The human soldiers raised their weapons instinctively, and Derek shouted for everyone to hold fire, and Lisa stepped forward with her hands raised in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace, and Jake moved past all of them, walking toward the dragons without hesitation, because he knew they would never hurt him, and he heard Lisa call his name in warning, but he ignored her. Thunder lowered his massive head and pressed his snout against Jake's chest hard enough to nearly knock him over, and Jake laughed and placed both hands on the dragon's warm scales and spoke to him in Silveran, telling him how much he had missed him and asking if he had been well. And Thunder responded with a rumbling sound that Jake felt in his bones, and Whisper pushed her way between them, demanding her own greeting. The human team watched in stunned silence as their colleague embraced two creatures that could easily kill him with a single bite. And Lisa realized in that moment that Jake's mission reports had left out far more than she had suspected, and she made a mental note to have a very long conversation with him about operational security and full disclosure once this diplomatic mission was complete. Then she appeared walking between her dragons with the same grace and presence that had haunted Jake's dreams for 3 years, and Princess Kira looked exactly as he remembered her, with silver hair that caught the light and golden eyes that found him instantly among the group of humans, and she wore ceremonial armor that marked her as royalty, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and his heart hammered so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it, and for a moment he forgot about the diplomatic mission and the watching soldiers and everything, except the fact that she was real and here and looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. And he took a step forward, and then another, and she met him halfway. They stood facing each other, and the rest of the world seemed to fade into background noise. And Kira spoke first in perfect English with only the slightest accent, and she said, "Welcome home, Jake Martinez. I have waited for you," and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, like music played on crystal strings, and Jake felt tears prick his eyes because she had learned his language and she had waited. He wanted to say so many things to tell her that he had thought about her every day, and that leaving her had been the hardest thing he had ever done, and that he had volunteered for this mission the moment he heard about it, specifically because it meant he might see her again. But all he managed was a simple "Hello, Kira," and his voice came out rough with emotion. She smiled then, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, and she reached out and took his hand in hers, and her skin was warm and familiar. And Jake felt something inside him that had been broken for 3 years suddenly click back into place. And behind them, he heard Lisa clear her throat diplomatically, reminding them that they had an audience and a mission to complete. Kira turned to address the human delegation, and her expression shifted from personal warmth to formal diplomacy, and she introduced herself as Princess Kira of the Crystal Forests and acting ruler of the Silveran territories, and she welcomed them to her world on behalf of her people, and explained that the Silveran Council had agreed to meet with Earth representatives to discuss the possibility of establishing formal relations between their civilizations. Lisa stepped forward and introduced herself and the rest of the team, and she thanked Kira for agreeing to meet with them and expressed Earth's hope that this could be the beginning of a beneficial relationship between their peoples, and she spoke with practiced diplomatic ease. But Jake could see the questions in her eyes as she glanced between him and Kira, trying to figure out exactly what their relationship was. Kira gestured toward the forest and explained that she would escort them to the council chambers, which were located in the capital city, about an hour away by dragon flight, and several of the human team members exchanged nervous glances at the mention of flying on Dragonback, but Kira assured them that Thunder and Whisper were perfectly capable of carrying multiple passengers safely, and that this was the quickest and most practical way to reach their destination. Derek, the security chief, looked like he wanted to protest, but Lisa accepted the offer with professional grace, and the team began preparing for what would be most of their first experience flying on the back of a dragon, and Jake helped explain the basics of how to hold on and where to sit and how to trust the dragons because they would never drop a passenger, no matter how much that passenger might panic during flight. As the team climbed onto the dragons' backs, Kira stayed close to Jake, and she spoke quietly in Silveran so only he could hear, and she told him that they had much to discuss, but it would have to wait until after the formal diplomatic proceedings were complete. And Jake nodded, understanding that duty had to come before personal matters, even though every fiber of his being wanted to pull her aside and talk about everything that had happened and everything he had felt for the past 3 years. Thunder took flight, first carrying Lisa and half the diplomatic team, and Whisper followed with the rest, including Jake, and Kira sat behind him with her arms around his waist to keep him steady, and the familiar sensation of her presence so close made Jake's head spin, and he had to remind himself to breathe and focus on the task at hand instead of thinking about how perfectly she fit against him. They flew over the crystal forests, and Jake pointed out landmarks to the other team members, who stared in wonder at the impossible beauty of Silvara and the floating islands connected by bridges of living light and the waterfalls that flowed in directions that defied Earth physics, and he explained what he knew about the ecosystem and the unique properties of the crystal formations that made up so much of the planet's structure. As they approached the capital city, Jake saw structures that he had never seen during his previous time on Silvara. Because Kira's sanctuary had been far from any major population centers, and the city was built into and around massive crystal formations that towered hundreds of feet into the air, and the buildings seemed to grow organically from the crystal itself, rather than being constructed on top of it, and thousands of elf people moved through the streets going about their daily lives. The dragons landed in a courtyard made entirely of crystal that had been polished until it reflected the sky like a mirror, and Jake helped the other team members dismount, while trying not to stare at everything around him because the capital city was even more impressive up close than it had been from the air. And everywhere he looked, he saw elf people pausing in their activities to watch the human visitors with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. Kira led them through wide corridors that curved in ways that seemed impossible, and the walls glowed with soft light that came from within the crystal itself, rather than from any external source. And Jake noticed that the temperature remained perfectly comfortable, despite the lack of any visible climate control system. And he realized that the Silverans had integrated their technology so seamlessly with their environment that it was impossible to tell where nature ended and engineering began. They passed through several chambers decorated with what Jake assumed were works of art, though many of them incorporated living plants that grew in patterns too perfect to be natural and moved in response to the presence of observers. And Lisa asked questions about Silveran culture and history, and Kira answered with the patience of someone who had explained these things many times before, though Jake noticed she kept glancing at him as if to confirm he was really there. The council chamber was a vast, circular room with a domed ceiling that showed the sky above as clearly as if there were no roof at all, and 12 seats arranged in a circle were occupied by elf elders who wore robes in colors that Jake had learned represented different regions and specialties within Silveran society, and they stood as Kira entered and bowed their heads in respect, though Jake could see that some of them looked at the human visitors with clear disapproval. Kira introduced the human delegation, formally using their full names and titles, and explained that they had come seeking to establish diplomatic relations between Earth and Silvara, and she spoke with authority that surprised Jake, because 3 years ago she had been uncertain about her role as princess. But now she commanded the room with confidence that suggested she had grown into her position in ways that went beyond mere time passing. The eldest council member, a woman with hair like spun silver, who introduced herself as Elder Maya, stepped forward and addressed the humans in slightly accented English, and she explained that the council had debated for many months whether to allow Earth representatives to visit Silvara, and that opinion remained divided on whether opening relations with humanity would benefit or endanger their people. Lisa responded with a carefully prepared speech about mutual respect and shared exploration of the galaxy and the potential for trade and cultural exchange that would enrich both civilizations. and she spoke eloquently about humanity's desire to learn from older and wiser species, and to contribute what knowledge and resources Earth could offer in return. Another council member, an elf man with sharp features named Elder Nathan, interrupted to ask what exactly humanity had to offer, a civilization that had existed for tens of thousands of years and had long ago solved most of the problems that still plagued younger species, and his tone was not quite hostile, but definitely skeptical, and Jake saw several other council members nod in agreement. Before Lisa could respond, Jake stepped forward and asked permission to speak, and Kira's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she nodded for him to continue, and Jake addressed the council in Silveran, which caused several elders to lean forward with increased interest, and he told them that humanity had little to offer in terms of technology or magical knowledge, but that Earth had something the Silverans seemed to have lost, which was hunger. He explained that humans were hungry for knowledge and experience and connection with others, and that this hunger drove them to explore and create and push boundaries in ways that sometimes led to disaster, but also sometimes led to breakthroughs, and he suggested that perhaps Silvara had become so comfortable in its perfection that it had forgotten what it felt like to reach for something just beyond grasp. The council chamber fell silent, and Jake worried that he had overstepped and offended them. But then Elder Maya laughed, and it was a sound like bells ringing, and she said that Princess Kira had been right about this particular human, and that he possessed the audacity and insight that she had described in her reports, and Jake glanced at Kira, who was trying not to smile. Elder Nathan stood and walked closer to study Jake with intense scrutiny, and he asked how one human who had spent mere weeks on Silvara could claim to understand what their civilization lacked. And Jake met his gaze steadily and replied that he made no such claim, but only offered an observation from an outsider's perspective, and that the Silverans were free to reject his thoughts if they found no value in them. The elder considered this, and then turned to Kira and asked if she had spent 3 years convincing the council to meet with Earth representatives, solely because of this one human, and Kira raised her chin and said yes without hesitation. And the elder nodded slowly and said that such dedication suggested either wisdom or foolishness, and time would reveal which. The council debated among themselves in rapid Silveran that even Jake struggled to follow completely, and he caught fragments about the risks of contamination from human culture and the potential benefits of new perspectives, and whether one princess's attachment to an alien should influence policy decisions that would affect their entire civilization. Finally, Elder Maya raised her hand for silence and addressed the human delegation, and she explained that the council would grant a provisional agreement allowing limited contact between Earth and Silvara, with strict protocols about what information could be shared and what areas of their world would remain restricted, and she emphasized that this agreement could be revoked at any time if the Silverans determined that humanity posed a threat to their way of life. Lisa accepted these terms with diplomatic grace and thanked the council for their willingness to consider Earth's proposal, and she promised that humanity would respect all boundaries and protocols established by the Silverans and work to prove themselves worthy of this opportunity. The formal proceedings concluded, and Kira led the human team to guest quarters that had been prepared for them in a section of the palace reserved for visiting dignitaries, and the rooms were beautiful and comfortable, though clearly designed for people who were taller and longer lived than humans, and Jake helped his teammates get settled while fielding questions about his previous time on Silver Elisa, pulled him aside once the others were occupied, and asked directly what his relationship with Princess Kira was, and Jake hesitated because he honestly did not know how to answer that question. And he told her that 3 years ago, Kira had saved his life, and they had become close during his recovery, but that he had returned to Earth before anything could develop. Beyond friendship, Lisa studied his face and said that whatever had or had not happened 3 years ago, it was clear that both he and the princess had strong feelings for each other now, and she needed to know if this would compromise his ability to serve Earth's interests during these negotiations, and Jake promised that he would never let personal feelings interfere with his duty, even though he knew that promise might be harder to keep than he wanted to admit. After Lisa left, Jake found himself alone in his quarters, staring out a window that overlooked the crystal forests and wondering what would happen next, because the diplomatic mission had barely begun. And already he felt pulled in multiple directions between his duty to Earth and his feelings for Kira and his uncertainty about whether she still wanted what they had started 3 years ago. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to find Kira standing in the doorway, and she had changed out of her ceremonial armor into simpler clothing, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. And Jake felt his heart skip several beats because she looked exactly like she had during those quiet evenings in her sanctuary when they would sit together and talk for hours about everything and nothing. She asked if he had time to talk privately, and Jake nodded and stepped aside to let her enter, and she moved to the window and stood beside him, looking out at the view. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. And Jake felt the weight of 3 years of separation pressing down on them, making it hard to know where to begin. Kira spoke first and told him that she had thought about him every day since he left, and that she had thrown herself into convincing the council to open relations with Earth because it was the only way she could think of to see him again, without abandoning her responsibilities to her people. And Jake listened with growing amazement as she described the political maneuvering and careful arguments she had used over 3 years to change minds that had been closed for centuries. He asked why she had gone to such lengths for him, when she could have had anyone from her own long-lived people, and Kira turned to face him and said that longevity meant nothing compared to genuine connection, and that in the few months they had spent together, she had felt more alive and more herself than she had in the previous century of her existence. Jake reached out and took her hand and told her that leaving Silvara had been the hardest decision of his life, and that he had only done it because he believed she deserved someone who could stand. The following weeks passed in a blur of diplomatic meetings and cultural exchanges, and every moment Jake spent in official capacity as Earth's representative made him more aware of how complicated his situation had become because he was falling in love with Kira all over again, while trying to maintain professional objectivity about the negotiations that would determine the future relationship between their two civilizations. Lisa noticed the growing tension and pulled him aside one afternoon, after a particularly long council session, and she told him bluntly that he needed to decide whether he was on this mission as a diplomat or as Kira's suitor, because he could not effectively be both. And Jake knew she was right, but he also knew that separating his personal feelings from his professional duties was becoming impossible. The other team members had varying reactions to the situation, and Derek, the security chief, thought Jake was compromising the mission and creating potential security risks, while some of the younger diplomats found the romance between species fascinating and asked endless questions about Silvaran courtship customs that Jake did not know how to answer, because he and Kira had never discussed what they were to each other in any formal sense. Kira faced similar pressures from her own people, and Elder Nathan in particular made no secret of his disapproval of her attachment to a short-lived human, and he argued in council sessions that Jake attended that opening Silvara to Earth contact was dangerous enough, without their princess forming romantic bonds that would end in heartbreak when the human inevitably aged and died while she remained young. But Kira defended her choices with fierce determination, and she pointed out that the council had no authority over her personal life, only over matters of state, and that her feelings for Jake had nothing to do with the diplomatic agreements being negotiated, and Jake watched her stand up to elders who had lived for thousands of years and felt his admiration for her grow even stronger. Thunder and Whisper became regular companions during his stay, and Jake spent hours with them, learning more about the bond they shared with Kira and discovering that the dragons had their own opinions about everything, including his relationship with their bonded partner. And Whisper in particular seemed to approve, and would often nudge him toward Kira. When they were all together one evening, Kira took Jake, flying on Whisper's back without any of the other humans or any official purpose, and they soared high above the crystal forests until the capital city looked like a cluster of jewels far below. And Kira directed Whisper to land on one of the floating islands that drifted through Silvara's upper atmosphere. They sat on the edge of the island with their legs dangling over the side and watched the twin suns set in colors that Earth's sky had never produced, and Jake asked Kira what would happen when the diplomatic mission ended and he had to return to Earth, and she was silent for a long time before answering. She told him that she had been thinking about that question constantly, and that she had 3 options, and none of them were perfect. And the first option was to maintain a long-distance relationship, visiting each other when diplomatic duties allowed, and hoping that the separation would not erode what they had built. And Jake could hear in her voice that she did not think this option would work. The second option was for her to abdicate her position and come to Earth with him and live out his natural lifespan before returning to Silvara and resuming her duties. And this option would allow them to be together but would require her to abandon her people during what could be a critical period of adjustment to contact with humanity. The third option was for Jake to stay on Silvara permanently, and Jake's breath caught, because he had not allowed himself to even consider this possibility. And Kira explained that the council would never officially approve such an arrangement, but that they also could not stop her from keeping him as a guest indefinitely if he chose to stay. Jake asked what she wanted, and Kira turned to look at him with those golden eyes that seemed to see straight through him, and she said that she wanted him to be happy, and that she would accept whatever decision he made because she loved him too much to trap him in a choice that would make him miserable. And it was the first time either of them had spoken the word love out loud. He told her that he loved her too, and that he had loved her since before he left 3 years ago, and that the idea of staying on Silvara permanently was both terrifying and appealing, and that he needed time to think about what it would mean to leave behind Earth, and everyone he knew, and everything familiar to build a life on an alien world. They flew back to the capital in thoughtful silence, and Jake spent the next several days wrestling with the biggest decision of his life, and he called home using the communication equipment the team had brought and talked to his parents and his sister, and tried to explain without really explaining that he might not be coming back to Earth when the mission ended. His mother cried and his father asked hard questions about whether he was thinking clearly or just caught up in the excitement of an alien romance, and his sister told him that she would support whatever choice he made but that she would miss him terribly. And Jake felt guilt pressed down on him because choosing Kira meant hurting people he loved. Lisa noticed his distraction during meetings and confronted him privately, and Jake told her everything, and she listened without interrupting and then asked if he understood that staying on Silvara would mean giving up not just his life on Earth but any chance of advancing his career or contributing to humanity's exploration of space. In any official capacity, Jake said he understood. But Lisa pressed further and made him consider whether he would resent Kira eventually when the novelty wore off, and he found himself isolated from his own species, with no way to go back, and Jake admitted he did not know but that he thought the risk was worth taking, because the alternative was living the rest of his life, knowing he had walked away from something real. The diplomatic negotiations concluded successfully after 6 weeks, and Earth and Silvara signed a preliminary agreement establishing trade relations and cultural exchange programs, and regular communication channels, and Lisa praised Jake's contributions to the mission, and told him privately that his insights into Silvaran culture had been invaluable, and that Earth would benefit greatly from the relationship he had helped build. On the final evening before the transport ship was scheduled to depart, Jake requested a private meeting with the council, and Kira looked surprised because he had not told her what he planned to say, and the elders gathered in the council chamber, and Jake stood before them and spoke in Silvaran. He told them that he had been offered a position on Earth, helping to coordinate the new diplomatic relationship with Silvara, but that he wanted to respectfully decline that position, and instead request permission to remain on Silvara as a cultural liaison and student of their civilization. And several council members exchanged glances that suggested they had expected this. Elder Nathan asked bluntly if his real reason for wanting to stay was to pursue a relationship with Princess Kira, and Jake met his gaze and said yes. That was part of his motivation, but not all of it, and that he genuinely wanted to learn more about Silvaran society and help facilitate understanding between their peoples, and that he believed he could serve both Earth and Silvara better by staying here. Elder Maya asked what he would do if the council denied his request, and Jake said honestly that he did not know, but that he hoped they would at least consider it. And she smiled slightly and said that the council had already discussed this possibility extensively, because it had been obvious to everyone except perhaps Jake himself that he and Kira were heading toward this decision. The council voted, and the result was 7 in favor and 5 against, and Elder Maya announced that Jake would be granted provisional residency on Silvara for a period of 5 years, at which point his status would be reviewed, and his contribution to mutual understanding between species would be evaluated, and Jake felt relief wash over him so intensely that his knees went weak. Kira stood and thanked the council formally and then turned to Jake, and the expression on her face was pure joy, and she maintained her composure until they left the council chamber. But the moment they were in the hallway, she threw her arms around him and held him so tightly he could barely breathe and whispered, "Thank you," in his ear. Jake returned to the guest quarters to tell his team the news, and Lisa shook her head, but smiled and said she had prepared a transfer request for him just in case, and that Earth's government had already approved reassigning him to permanent liaison duty if Silvara accepted him, and Jake realized that she had seen this coming long before he had admitted it to himself. The rest of the team had mixed reactions, and Derek muttered something about this being a terrible security precedent, but even he seemed grudgingly accepting, and several of the younger diplomats congratulated Jake and asked if he would send reports back to Earth about what it was like to live among the Silverans, and Jake promised he would. The transport ship departed the next morning, and Jake stood with Kira watching it rise through the purple clouds until it disappeared from view. And he felt a moment of panic, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, but then Kira took his hand, and that panic faded because whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with her beside him. The first months of Jake's permanent residence on Silvara passed in a constant state of adjustment and discovery, and he moved from the guest quarters into rooms adjacent to Kira's private chambers in the palace, and every day brought new experiences that reminded him just how different this world was from everything he had known, and yet somehow it felt more like home than Earth ever had. Thunder and Whisper accepted his permanent presence with what Jake interpreted as satisfaction, and the dragons spent more time with him, teaching him in their own way about the deep magic that connected all living things on Silvara, and Jake discovered he had a limited ability to sense the energy flows that the Silvarans manipulated so effortlessly, though his human biology made it difficult to do more than observe. Kira became his guide and teacher and lover and partner, and their relationship deepened in ways that went beyond the romance that had drawn them together, and they learned to navigate the practical challenges of building a life together. When they came from such different backgrounds and had such different lifespans and expectations, the age difference weighed on Jake more than he wanted to admit, because Kira had lived for over 200 years before they met and would live for centuries after he died, and sometimes when they attended council meetings or cultural events, he felt painfully aware that he was the youngest person in the room by at least a century, and that everyone was thinking about how briefly he would be part of Kira's life. But Kira had a way of making those thoughts seem irrelevant, and she told him once that she had spent 200 years existing, but only started truly living when she met him, and that she would rather have 50 years of genuine partnership than an eternity of comfortable loneliness. And Jake tried to believe her even when his doubts crept in during quiet moments. He took his role as cultural liaison seriously and began compiling detailed reports about Silveran society that he sent back to Earth, and he worked to help other humans who came to visit understand the subtle protocols and unspoken rules that governed interaction with the elf people, and he served as a bridge between two civilizations that were still learning to trust each other. Lisa returned several times leading new diplomatic delegations, and she always made time to have private conversations with Jake, asking how he was adjusting and whether he had any regrets, and Jake answered honestly that some days were harder than others, but that he had made the right choice. And Lisa seemed to accept this, though he could see concern in her eyes when she thought he was not looking a Silvaran. People gradually accepted Jake's presence, though some remained skeptical about a human living among them permanently, and Elder Nathan in particular continued to voice doubts about whether allowing an outsider into their inner circles was wise. But even he had to admit that Jake's insights had proven valuable in helping the council understand human psychology and motivations. Jake learned more about the history of Silvara and discovered that the elf people had once been explorers who traveled among the stars seeking knowledge and connection with other species, but that a series of tragic encounters with hostile civilizations had made them withdraw into isolation thousands of years ago, and the decision to open contact with Earth represented a tentative attempt to overcome that ancient trauma. He also learned more about dragon bonding and the rare gift that allowed certain Silverans to form mental connections with the ancient creatures, and Kira explained that she had bonded with Thunder and Whisper when she was barely 50 years old, which was considered extremely young for such a partnership, and that the bond had shaped her entire life, giving her purpose and responsibility beyond her role as Princess One. Afternoon, about 8 months after Jake had committed to staying on Silvara, Kira took him to meet the dragon elders who lived in the highest peaks of the floating mountains, and these ancient beings had existed for tens of thousands of years, and their wisdom was sought by the Silveran Council on matters of great importance. The eldest dragon, whose name translated roughly to Ancient Sky, examined Jake with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations and spoke directly into his mind in a way that made his head ache. And the dragon asked why a human thought he could build a life with an elf who would outlive him by centuries. Jake answered as honestly as he could that he did not think he could build a permanent life, in the way the dragon meant, but that he could build a meaningful life that would matter to both him and Kira, for as long as it lasted, and that surely something genuine and temporary was better than something false and eternal, Ancient Sky considered this and then spoke to Kira, asking if she understood that loving a human meant she would experience grief that most Silverans never faced, because most bonded with partners who would age alongside them for centuries, and Kira replied that she understood completely and accepted that pain as the price of real connection. The dragon was silent for a long time, and then said something that surprised both of them, and suggested that perhaps the Silvarans had become too focused on avoiding pain and loss, and that they had forgotten that love was supposed to involve risk, and that a civilization that chose safety over connection was already dying in the ways that mattered most. Jake and Kira flew back to the capital in thoughtful silence, and that evening they talked about what Ancient Sky had said and about the future they were building together. And Kira asked Jake if he had thought about what would happen to her after he died, and Jake admitted he tried not to think about it because the idea of leaving her alone was painful. She told him that she would grieve him deeply when the time came, but that she would not regret their years together, and that she hoped he would give her permission to remember him fully rather than trying to protect her from future pain. And Jake promised that he would never ask her to diminish what they had for the sake of making his death easier on her. As the first year of his permanent residence approached, Jake received a message from Earth that his father had died, and the news hit him harder than he expected because he had not been there and had not said goodbye, and guilt consumed him for days as he questioned whether staying on Silvara had been selfish. Kira held him while he cried and listened while he talked about his father, and she did not offer platitudes or try to minimize his pain, and she simply stayed with him through the grief, and Jake realized that this was what partnership meant, and that she would be there for him, through the hard moments just as he would be there for her. The council conducted its first review of Jake's residency, and voted unanimously to extend his permission to remain on Silvara indefinitely, and Elder Maya told him privately that he had exceeded their expectations and proven that humans could integrate into Silveran society without destroying what made it unique, and Jake felt pride at the recognition, though he knew he still had much to learn. He began teaching a small group of young Silverans about Earth culture and human history, and found that he enjoyed sharing his perspective with people who had never experienced life on his home planet, and his students asked thoughtful questions that made him see humanity in new ways and helped him appreciate aspects of Earth culture he had taken for granted. Kira's duties as acting ruler increased as the council prepared to formally crown her as queen, now that the period of mourning for her father had passed, and Jake watched her grow into her role with grace and strength, and he felt honored to support her even though he knew he could never fully understand the weight she carried. They established routines and traditions that blended human and Silveran customs, and celebrated festivals from both cultures and created new rituals that were uniquely theirs, and their home became a space where two worlds overlapped and neither had to dominate the other. Thunder and Whisper remained constant presences, and Jake developed his own relationship with the dragons separate from their bond with Kira, and they took him flying without her sometimes and showed him parts of Silvara that few even among the elf people had seen, and he felt grateful for their acceptance too. Years into his residence, Jake was invited to address the full council about the progress of Earth-Silvara relations, and he spoke about the growing trade in technology and art, and the exchange programs that had brought dozens of humans to Silvara, and several Silverans to Earth. and about the mutual enrichment that came from genuine cross-cultural dialogue. He also spoke more personally about what he had learned from living among people so different from himself, and about how the experience had changed his understanding of what it meant to be human and to be alive. And several council members who had initially opposed his residency told him afterward that he had given them new perspective. Elder Nathan approached him after the session and admitted grudgingly that he had been wrong about Jake, and that the human had proven himself worthy of Princess Kira's love. And Jake thanked him for the acknowledgement, though he pointed out that he had never tried to prove his worthiness, only to be genuine. That evening, Jake and Kira stood on their private balcony watching the twin suns set, and Jake reflected on how much his life had changed in the 3 years since he had first crashed on Silvara, and he thought about the choice he had made to stay and about the future they were building together one day at a time.